Okay, here we are at part 2 of Art in the Court of Louis XIV for students at New Jersey City University. You notice my background has changed. As you know, I'm traveling. So this is my fabulous hotel room in Frederick, Maryland. But regardless of that, let's continue talking about Jean-Baptiste Colbert and French mercantilism and Louis XIV's wars. So Colbert was Louis's finance minister, which is an unenviable position when you think about how much money Louis was spending on things that didn't really need to be spent, like the Palace of Versailles and the retinues and all of that sort of thing. France at this time was adhering to a system of economic growth called mercantilism. Mercantilism is somewhat similar to capitalism in the sense that things are being bought and sold with relatively little government intervention according to market conditions. However, mercantilism relied upon the importing of raw materials from colonies. And this is to provide cheap materials for domestic manufacturers. So essentially, from France's colonies in the Americas and from the other European colonies, Europe was bringing stuff over. In the Spanish colonies, it was mostly silver. They were bringing silver over. The British colonies, it was cotton, tobacco, other agricultural goods. The French colonies, it was largely timber and beaver pelt. But regardless of what it was, the mercantilist system relied upon these cheap raw materials to provide fuel for the domestic manufacturers. This is pre-industrialism. There was industry in the sense that people were making things and selling things. We're not talking about factories and huge industrial production as of yet. This is relatively small scale production. If you have to adhere to mercantilism, the problem is that your competitors can undercut you. So why buy your timber from your own colonies when you can buy timber from the British for far cheaper? And the way around that was to impose high tariffs. A high tariff is a tax on imported goods from other nations. This is a traditional way to react to a bad economy, is to tax imports so that you have to buy domestically so that the domestic economy improves. It works in an economy of this scale. It does not work on a larger economy. So Louis XIV also took part in a lot of wars. He ruled France for 72 years. Remember, when he took the throne, he was a child, and he had to be ruled through a regent. And he spent a lot of the time at war, both against rebels in France and then throughout Europe. So he's trying to expand his borders largely at the expense of the Netherlands, Spain, and Germany. The European powers eventually decided to join forces to try to oppose his attempts. This was because Europe was adhering to a system of stability called a balance of power, where the nations would work together to make sure that no one nation became powerful enough to disrupt European peace and to dominate the continent. The most famous of these wars was the War of Spanish Succession, where Louis's grandson Philippe was going to inherit the Spanish throne. He was next in line. However, other nations, mostly Britain, did not want to allow the two nations to be joined as one. So the war raged for about 13 years, and it was relatively indecisive. At the end, it was decided that Philippe could remain king of Spain, so that Louis's favorite candidate to the throne did get the throne, but France would not be allowed to unite the two thrones under one crown. So this was kind of the high watermark of Louis's military adventures, but also the beginning of French decline. Even though his favorite candidate got to the throne of Spain, his ultimate goal of unifying Spain and France into one country was not realized. So Louis had a lot of costly mistakes. These wars drained the French treasury. Philippe II found the same problem in Spain. Toward the end of his reign, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes was issued by Henry IV of France, who had become king after a series of religious wars between the Huguenots and the Catholics. Henry himself was a Huguenot, but while becoming king, he agreed to be baptized as a Catholic. So he attended Mass in Notre Dame Cathedral, and afterward one of his attendants asked him, so how does it feel to be Catholic? Something along those lines. And Henry said, well, Paris was worth the Mass, meaning that he'd converted, only in name, not really in spirit. And as part of this, he issued the Edict of Nantes, which allowed for religious tolerance in France, allowed Protestants to practice their faith freely. So Louis revoked this edict. It had been, a couple of generations since Henry IV, and he felt that the Catholics could sort of just ignore this edict. So he revoked the Edict of Nantes, and about 100,000, although the number can be somewhat debated, Huguenots fled France. This was a bad move because the Huguenots were extremely hardworking. In particular, a lot of the sort of proto-industry in France was Huguenot-led. Philippe of Spain did something similar in Spain. Both these countries lost a lot of their most industrious workers through the prosecution of the Protestants. There's a theory that the Protestants are hardworking and the Catholics are not. It's tied into this theory of the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. It's largely bunk. It's mostly that the industries were located in areas where the Huguenots were living. It's not that they were hardworking because they were Protestant. They were hardworking because the industries that they had access to were where they were. But still, they were the people who were working there and knew how to produce the industrial goods. So kicking them out of France was a bad idea. Louis outlived his sons and grandsons, not all of his grandsons, but most of them. And he left his 5-year-old great-grandson on the throne when he died. Obviously, a 5-year-old taking the throne is never a recipe for stability, ensuring a long regency, since the age of maturity was usually about 20. So you have a long regency for this 5-year-old, and the country was just badly run. To add to this, there was a series of bad harvests, which wasn't the king's fault, but certainly, the economy of France suffered because of it, and the heavy taxes that had to be levied to pay for all the excesses of Louis, all the art, all the courtly expenses, all of the building of the Palace of Versailles and other palaces, and most dangerously of all, his wars. All of this had combined to basically wreck the French treasury, and France was drowning under a series of bad harvests, weak economy from the expelling of the Huguenots, and heavy taxes. Louis XV, who was the great-grandson of Louis XVI, was too weak to deal with these problems. So I told you a bit about the history of Louis and how his attempts at making France an absolutist state had been successful during his reign. He had effectively destroyed the power of the nobles, made France, an absolute monarchy. He was relatively successful in intervening with military affairs, although toward the end of his reign, some of these wars started to go badly. And we saw how toward the end of his reign, everything started to come undone. A big part of Louis's staying in control of France and turning France into an absolutist monarchy was his patronage of the arts and his patronage of the court of Versailles. He made the nobles come to Versailles to do him homage and held the court there, instead of issuing orders to the nobles in far-flung provinces hoping they'd follow them. part of Louis's apparatus was the ballet, which sounds a bit funny, but allow me to explain. Basically, he would have these special ballets where he himself would be one of the main performers and only invite a select few to come and view the performance. This basically caused competition among the nobles, where they wanted to be one of the favorites so they could come to this special ballet and come and see the king dance. And if you were striving to be one of these favorites, you would sort of do the king's bidding, whatever it was. And this is a whole part of his absolutist monarchy, the whole part of trying to keep the nobles not only loyal to him, but subservient to him. So the ballet was pretty big during the reign of Louis. And it wasn't obviously just the king dancing. There was a whole series of ballets that came out of his reign. So I'm going to show you a clip from one of them as part of the culture of the reign of Louis XIV. So you can see, obviously beautiful to look at, but what was the big deal? And the big deal was the exclusivity of it, where you could only come see Louis dance if you were one of his favorites. And to be one of his favorites, you had to carry out the king's will. And this played into his whole system of absolutist monarchy. He couldn't get rid of the nobles offhand, but what he could do was find a way to control them. So the art at the court of Louis XIV was essential to his control of the country. Okay, that's it for today, and that's it for this lecture. This is part 2 of 2. Make sure you watch both parts. There'll be other assignments posted. There'll be a discussion board, a quiz of some kind, so be aware of it. Okay, and I will see you guys on Wednesday.